afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Charity Recruit webinar with myself, Emily from Charity Recruit, and also Louis. So you'll have seen, hopefully, from the information that we've sent through to you, that Louis is an entrepreneur, a speaker, and an expert in consumer psychology. Louis launched his own business at the age of 12. And built a £6.5 million brand operating in 17 countries by the time he was 20. So he's got a wealth of experience. He's spent the last decade advising organisations, including not-for-profits, on how to use behavioural science and data to drive sustainable growth, optimise supporter engagement, and unlock new revenue streams. So today, Louis is going to be sharing some of those strategies with us, and hopefully you'll take away some good tips for your organisations going forward. So before I hand over to Louis, just a few housekeeping points. We're looking at the session lasting probably between 35 to 40 minutes. We'll have time for some questions and answers at the end. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat as we go along. We are going to record the session and that'll be available for you all afterwards. So without further ado, please welcome Louis.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I hope you can all kind of see and hear me today. We've just moved into a new house and my camera setup is slightly off, so I apologise for kind of glancing down. But yeah, thanks, Emily. Great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, it's been an interesting last 20 or so years, and as Emily said, really I've focused an awful lot of the last since 2015. Full-time advising on consumer psychology, which is my specialty. So I just want to be really clear about why I'm here today. This is it. So I really ultimately want to help you raise more money and do it in a way that uses human psychology and behavior science. And what I found was that that was the kind of key to my unlock. Now I'm not some sort of strange genius. I just happened to meet this interesting guy here called Robin. So I was at a networking event. That's an AI render, actually, quite accurate. I was at an event in London. I was 14 and I saw this guy with a purple waistcoat and a green trilby hat and thought, this is the kind of guy that I'd like to go and speak to. And it turned out that Robin had bounced around all the biggest ad agencies in London and New York and had then since set up the kind of first of its kind of a sort of eco-sustainable agency to help brands break out into the market. This was at the time when less people cared about these sort of issues. So Robin was using behavioural psychology to help them do that. And so everything really changed in meeting him, and he kind of sat me down and asked me a version of this question. How do you expect to convince people to choose you without understanding what drives human behavior? I didn't have a good answer for him at the time. I'm still completely figuring it out. I think it's one of those things that you'll never 100% understand, but it certainly sparked an obsession. That's the only way I can describe it for me. And that allowed me to effectively go from the family kitchen table. That photo is slightly younger than when I started, but so I've always been into cooking and baking. And then at 12, I set up the chocolate business. Obviously met Robin at 14, and then the kind of growth curve was really exponential. So as Emily said, within 8 years of starting the company, it was worth 6.5 mil and trading in 17 countries. And I attribute a huge amount of that to kind of Robin's help and mentoring and tutelage in understanding human behavior. Because I think if we do think about it as organizations, we rely so much on human behavior, but a lot of the time, and exactly as Robin pointed out to me, we probably don't spend that much time understanding what that means for us. So yeah, since then I've worked with lots of big organizations that you'll sort of know. So, big corporates in both consumer and retail, but I've had a real passion ever since 2006 of working with charities and non-profits. And so, yeah, this really is what this presentation is all about. So what I want to get across to you early on is that you depend on changing behavior. So every time somebody donates, whether it's a company, an individual, high net worth individual, they are changing behavior. And that's really what consumer psychology is all about and is I'm obsessed about, is understanding what causes that change of behaviour. And it's basically somebody choosing you again, choosing to donate in a different way, choosing to donate in a bigger way. Those are all kind of behaviour changes. And so why charities, you might be asking? Well, I want to make a living, not a lot. I'm very clear on that, always have been. It's never been about money for me. The business grew and grew well and quickly, but it was about the impact that I was actually able to make. And so here's a photo of me as a young lad giving a check to one of our favourite charities that we used to work with. So I donated 10% of my profits minimum to conservation organisations. And they were, this Phil was our smallest charity. He was a tiger charity based in Leicester. There were literally 2 people in the charity. He'd raise money and then go over to India and equip anti-poaching squads. And I genuinely do believe that I have a debt to repay, as I think all of us do. But I'm very clear about that with myself, is that being here on this planet, I owe a lot. So that's why charities, it's because I really believe that's the case. And in terms of my values, I actually said no to a £5 million buyout from Unilever in 2015. I had spent over 10 years campaigning against the use of palm oil flat out in all kind of food and confectionery. It's not needed. Cosmetics is a little bit more complicated, but yeah, I'd spent 10 years campaigning against palm oil use and for its labelling in the UK. Won that one alongside a big campaign and lots of other companies and organisations. And at the age of 21, I was offered £5 million as a buyout. I said no, which at the time, I'm not going to lie, was a little bit tricky. That kind of money is relatively life-changing to an extent, but I decided that, under no circumstances would I ever forgive myself. And a lot of people I work with would never forgive me for doing that. So, just wanted to get that across. It's hopefully not just hollow words that you're hearing. I stand by my own values. So how can I help you on the call today? I believe that's by 3-step process. So people, planning and presentation. And the first thing I want to talk about is people before solutions. So I think all of us, whether we're in non-profits, charities, even companies, I think a lot of the time we get very focused on the solution, the thing, the service that we're doing, the good thing in the world. And we spend a lot of time focusing on that. People in companies spend all of their time on their product and service. And they sometimes forget that actually, whatever we're doing, we require people to choose us. So I always say to organizations, take a step back and let's really look at people before we actually think about the solution and what we're trying to get them to do or to offer. And so this is one of the first things that, I show a lot of people, is that a lot of the time when we think about people, we talk about demographics, right? And as you can see from this slide, these 2 people are both the same demographically. So that there is a big issue with demographics in the sense that when a lot of us talk about our audience or our personas or the people, this is one of the tools that people use. And as you can quite imagine, King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne would have pretty different buying habits of what, if you imagine them both going into a supermarket, they'd probably be buying a very different selection of foods. But the point is there that, demographically, they are the same. So I want to talk about something called psychographics. So demographics above the line tell us who the people are. Psychographics is about why people do what they do. So here's a good example. Greg and Barry, demographically exactly the same person. Psychographically, they're very different. So Greg basically shops at Waitrose because they're a market leader in animal welfare, and he's passionate about food and the environment. Barry, however, shops at Waitrose because it makes him look good in his social circle. So what you can actually see with these 2 people is, again, if you stop them at the end of their shop, looked in their trolleys, they'd have a completely different selection of foods, of brands, of things that they're doing, and even the time that they're spending in different areas of the supermarket. So one of the things that I think is really good for us all to do is to think a little bit more about the psychographics. So thinking about the people that we are seeking to serve, that we need to believe in us to support our causes. it's thinking about what drives them, the values, the morals, the principles, their personality, their reasonings. Now, you're obviously going to get, within different donors, you're going to get different psychographics playing a part. But I just want to draw attention to, I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can start with, is really start to delve into and thinking about what are the things that make them do what they do and choose us. And so, as an example, within corporates, you find that there's different psychographics that you can actually target. And it's whether people are more interested in how it makes them look as an organization, or how it makes them feel as an individual and as a team. So it's kind of important. And so, without getting into kind of too much detail, the idea behind this is you create different branches for different psychographics to go down. So this is as simple as I can kind of make it in the time that we have today. But the next stage then is, once you've started to look at the people, you've started to look at who they are, what might drive them, what behaviors you are looking for within them. The next stage is sort of planning. So it's effectively thinking about, when you're reaching out to these people, when you're talking to these people, how do you do it? And this is my super, super easy, simple framework that works for 90% of cases, whether it's a landing page, an email, a social post. It almost works for every instance. And it's only 4 stages. So it's hook. So like on social media, we generally only have about 6 to 20 seconds to grab somebody's attention. If within the first 6 to 20 seconds you haven't grabbed somebody's attention, you haven't hooked them into your message, your content, your proposition, you've lost them. And that has become more and more the case in websites, in landing pages, copy and email as well. So the first stage is really thinking about hook, and what I said about the psychographics. So it will depend on who the person is. Is it a general audience, or is it going to something specific? Is it going to a corporate? Is it going to a high net worth individual? Then you can think about this planning stage. So get your hook right, really think about what's going to grab them in the first few seconds. Why? So why it's relevant to them, or why they should care. Basically, that is one of the first things I always write when I'm thinking about a landing page or a web page or anything like that. I'm really putting in, okay, why are they going to care about this? So I've hooked them in, I've given them a few lines or a very small paragraph, and then I'm reinforcing that by saying, okay, here's why you should care. And you're writing it to them as a person, you're talking to them, not about yourself. I think we've all got in the habit of writing sometimes in third person, in web copy and emails and that sort of thing. But I can tell you very quickly that that's vastly ineffective compared to writing to the person. So why should you care? You're reaffirming that. And the next bit under that is sort of, why do you care? Why do you do it? So just to clarify, if it's a new project, if it's a new campaign, if it's something new you're doing as an organization, just reaffirm that and say, okay, the reason why we're doing this is the reason why we care, the reason why we're doing it now, the reason why you should act now. Once you've got the kind of why section done, you're moving to the how, which is how it's relevant to them. And this is a really important bit, because what I said about psychographics really comes in here. You've got to be really clear on how this works for them. So if they're an individual donor, how it's going to give them the warm and fuzzies, how you're going to show them what the impact is, how you're going to look after them, how you're going to involve them, how you're going to build a relationship with them. As a corporate, how you're going to help them convince their upper management. So the how section is really important, because it's really effectively you saying, this is how this is going to work in general, but more importantly, this is how it's going to work for you. And then finally is the what. So what is the ask? What's the proposition? What is the donation amount you need? What's the number? What's the figure? And so by doing this, it's very simplistic, and we haven't got a lot of time, but I could say, like I said, most of what I do, and for the last 20 or so years, has somewhat started with this loose framework and allowed me to build on it. So ultimately, the purpose of this framework is to invite them in on a journey. You're taking a customer on a journey. And so that hook, why, how, what principle works for a longer period of time as well, other than just a singular email or a social post. It's also thinking about how it works over time. So we as organizations, and deep in behavioral psychology and human behavior change, is people tend to want to buy into something rather than just a singular product. You see this with all of the kind of big brands and big organizations. They spend a lot of time thinking about the psychology of drawing people in and inviting them in on a journey. So whilst we're thinking about singular pieces of communication, we should also be thinking about how that works as a journey. And so I've, given a very quick example here of a customer journey effectively coming into what some of us call the funnel. So at the point where they kind of first are learning about you, understanding you, they visit the website, they get an email, they get communication. You should also be thinking about that hook to what proposition over a longer period of time. So when you're first getting them into the journey, it's more the hook. You're drawing them in, you're giving them small bite-sized bits of information, you're trying to draw them in, you get them interested, you're reflecting back at them things that they expect to be there. And then over time, you're building that up. So the next bit is relevancy. Why are they going to be interested? Why is it relevant? And over time, through that journey, you're building up that process. And then you get what's called these kind of divergent points. So that's really when you're starting to say, here's the offer, this is what we want. And it's a good idea to offer a couple of different routes. So that's kind of what this is showing, is that when you get to that point, you've built a bit of a relationship, you've taken somebody on a journey, you've got a few different points for them to go down. So like I said, the hook to what can also work longer term. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of akin to, I think, a lot of organizations and companies where you are asking people to come and climb a mountain with you. But if we're not really clear about what that looks like, where we're trying to get to, and we're not sometimes even clear on the mountain that we are trying to climb, it produces this kind of incoherent journey. And that's when we lose an awful lot of people. So funnels, we've all seen this probably at some point within, marketing and sales. I think funnels used to be very simple. I remember even in my early days of the business, a funnel was either, PR to a phone call, and then suddenly it was an email chain. Funnels used to be really simple. It was just a case of kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you'd gradually push somebody down the line. Funnels have got a little bit more complicated now, and I show this analogy a lot of a spider's web. So we've got all of these different things that might make up the edge of our funnel. So whether it's social media, it could be podcast, it could be recommendations. There's all of these different things that are actually now part of our funnel. And it's really useful to see it like that, because I think sometimes we can draw a disconnection between, a TikTok video versus a podcast interview. And in fact, the job of all of them really is to either get people into our funnel or to funnel them down into the center. And right at your center is this little icon, which for me represents the website. So at the moment, and things might change quite quickly because of what's happening with technology and AI, but right now, all of these things are funneling into our website. So I guess that's just me also saying that it's thinking about your customer journey within your own website, within your own email chains, within all of these things, but also thinking about the edge of our funnel and how we can bring people from social media and recommendations and podcasts and all of those sort of things into our funnel and to go deeper. And the last thing I would also mention about this is that people don't do what they expect them to do. So what happens is generally people will come into the funnel, they can kind of move across, they can see something else, they maybe join a WhatsApp group, they see an email, but what people can also do is move back up the funnel. So they might read an email that doesn't quite gel with them, that they don't really expect, they don't like. There's not always something we can do about that, but it's good to understand that sometimes people aren't just taking one linear path. So it's important for us to think about, if people are moving into our funnel, to think about our entire funnel and how we can consistently build a relationship with those people. So this was a guy that I did some work with a few years back. This is a guy called Tim Kobe. Fascinating guy, and he actually developed the Apple retail program with Steve Jobs for 16 years. And I asked him to give me his ultimate learning from his career, and he's one of the kind of key consumer psychology, behavioural science experts out there. And he said this: so information does not change consumer behaviour. So I just want to kind of finish this planning aspect on that, which is that sometimes we get really drawn into facts and figures and data and numbers, and it's Tim's experience, and as is mine and many others, that actually we've always got to remember that most of the time it's not information that changes consumer behaviour. His answer to my question, which was, well, what does? He said, it's human emotion, always. Human emotion is always the thing that changes consumer behaviour. It's not data, it's not persuasive spreadsheets, it's none of those things, it's always emotion. So I think finally, I just want to end on that by saying, when you're building that process, when you're building the kind of hook to what, it's also, and the customer journey, it's thinking about at every stage, where can we involve as much emotion, where can we build that emotional connection with people as much as possible. And so there is a huge amount of tools that we've got in our toolbox. For me, working in consumer psychology, there's 150, 200 different behavioural psychology principles or human behaviour principles that we can use. Thankfully, now with technology, you can research a lot of these things. By the way, these slides are going to be available. Charity Recruit are going to send them out to you, so don't worry about remembering all of this. But I would just say to you as well is to think about some of these things as we're going through our customer journeys and we're thinking about structures of things. We can actually use a lot of these behavioural psychology principles, and it just takes us researching about them, understanding a little bit, and then when we're producing things, to pull one of these things out and say, are we actually aligning this with human behaviour? So finally, presentation. So I want to draw your attention to something called costly signalling theory, which, if there was one thing that I wished every single organization on the planet understood more, it would be this. So costly signalling theory says that humans particularly, but all animals and species, value things more that cost in effort or money. So what that basically means is the way you present things matters far more than you would think. And so there's been a huge amount of data and research, particularly Ogilvy have done research for well over a decade on charity outreach. So they'll send 4 or 5 letters, exactly the same wording, exactly the same proposition for a donation ask. And consistently, the letters that do the best are the ones printed on the nicest card and the ones that are nicest designed with photos of animals and faces on it. So logically, again, this information doesn't change behavior. Logic would tell us that that shouldn't be the case, but in fact, it really, really is. So I would just say to all of you is that by thinking about this whole process, you're understanding people, you're understanding the sort of structure, you're planning it out. The final bit is how you present it really, really matters so much. So the way that your websites look, the way that your presentations and documents look, just matters so much more than you would ever believe is possible. So pretty matters. This is an example of Yale School of Art, not a particularly interesting or exciting website. And I see this a lot when I track advanced analytics with organizations and their websites. Most organizations are losing a huge amount of traffic and conversion by just having not very attractive documents and proposals. They're sending things on Word documents. They're sending things through on old landing pages. So I'd really impress upon you to spend a little bit of time and effort on the presentation side of things. And this is one of my favorite quotes from David Ogilvy. Don't condone what Ogilvy do, but I think this is a really great quote that sums up about people. So again, just drawing your attention to the fact that we're weird, we're strange, we're unusual, and a lot of the time logic matters far less than you'd think when it comes to persuading people to choose you, your organizations, and donate. So I know that was a pretty quick snapshot, lots of information. Like I said, I'll send the slides over to you, but hopefully has just helped make you think a little bit more about how you structure your your donation processes and your journeys.
Thank you for that, Louis. I found that fascinating, actually, from a consumer point of view. Has anybody any questions that they'd like to pose to Louis? I think we're all good there. Oh, Kevin.
I've got one. It's quite interesting, that point you made about information doesn't change people's perception or decisions. I agree with that, but I think it needs a follow through. So you then move from information doesn't change, but emotion changes to make a decision. Storytelling is a very powerful way of getting into somebody's emotion, but aren't we using information to actually tell the story to get the emotion to then get somebody to engage?
Sure, Kevin, I agree. I mean, I think that it's the way in which we tell the story, I guess, is the point. As you said, it's that information can be presented in lots of different ways, right? We can present it in a grey graph with a bar chart and a percentage line, or we can tell a story using exactly the same information and data, but put a human face on it, or put an animal face on it, or do something that's going to attract emotion. So I've been working with a conservation charity recently, and we've just got a really big partnership with a global consultancy firm. And their point to us was just the fact that because we were focusing on singular species and putting a face to sustainability using migratory species, that it suddenly became real. All these sort of dry facts and figures that they were exposed to all the time within sustainability, within the kind of corporate world, suddenly it was about, we're saving an osprey. It's a specific thing, it's a specific animal, and it's sort of anthropomorphized into a campaign that is following that journey. So now I agree, Kevin, it's just, you can take the same information, present it in a different way, write it in a different way, and also make it look nice. And suddenly what was dry information is a behavioural shift that somebody really kind of buys into.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other questions for Louis?
Yes, if I could ask a question, actually. So I'm quite new to writing funding applications, and I'm writing a whole different range of them, which probably makes the situation even more complicated. But I'm just wondering, especially for things like one-off grants and just smaller grants, I'm just wondering, when you said that take them on a journey, we invite them on a journey, and I think that's right. But how could I do that with like one-off grants? How do I give that kind of impression to like organizations that don't necessarily join us as such as a partner? They just give a lump sum of money and then maybe never hear from us again. Or how could I position that better?
Sure. So, Suzanne, I think grants is tricky because, again, some of them are just very transactional, right? You write the grant, you're submitting it, you're doing it within the framework that they're asking you to do it. And so it can be a little bit tricky. I think the only thing I would say to you that's been really good for me in the past is, if you're able to, and you're not always able to with certain funds, but is to sort of reach out to them and have conversations about them as an organization, where they're going, what is their strategy, what are they looking to do. So it goes back to that sort of psychographics piece of sort of understanding them more as an organization, what they're trying to do. Look at the posts that they're doing on social, read their reports, and you'll start to get a feeling of, sometimes, not always, but a thread that's moving through. And so then it's about figuring out how you can tell your story that better aligns with their goals, their wants, their needs, and hopefully, like you said, build a bit more of a relationship other than just a one-off transactional. I mean, like I said, grants is tricky because there's a million different avenues, and when you've got private organizations versus public, I mean, there's a huge amount of difference. I think the point about the psychographics is always to revert back to the people as core. So if it's an organization that does just, as a grant almost uniquely, they just want lots and lots of data and information, but understanding them as an organization, how they talk, how they speak, within their reports, you can actually use that to help you inform to write your grants and bids better. So, one of the things that's quite useful now is that you can download a load of their resources, download a load of their social posts, download, reports, data, anything you can get from that grant, load it into AI, and actually help AI help you to analyze that information and sort of say, look, are there particular keywords that you're noticing a lot? Is there a particular thread? Is there a particular way that they're writing and framing their information? So I think that's kind of useful in that instance, but also, in a similar way for corporates. One of the things that I always say to people is when you're taking people on a kind of corporate donor journey, your landing pages and your communication, your presentations should reflect that kind of corporate audience and the decision maker you're going after. So it should talk like them. It should use the same sorts of phrases that they're using. And of course, if it is for a specific corporate, if you are targeting somebody with a presentation or a proposal, it is a really good idea to sort of go back and think about what might drive their position to make behavioural shifts, what in their position do they need, and to also build that into your proposal. I mean, it's a really silly thing, but I've seen this be really effective, where if you're trying to engage younger startup companies, of which there's a huge potential for charities and non-profits at the moment, a lot of young companies are really want to make more impact on sustainability in the world and ESG. When you're sending them a proposal or a landing page, make sure that you're in casual clothing. It's a really silly thing to say, but actually you're reflecting back to them and saying, look, we understand you, we understand what you're looking for. If you're going to pitch to a large corporate and there's photos on your proposals, dress a little bit smarter. So it's personalizing your sort of outreach to people, and it's always putting them first and saying, how can we reflect back to them? If you were going after a law firm and you turned up at a meeting in a hoodie, it may not be perceived that well. If you went to pitch to a tech startup and you were in a suit, the opposite would happen. So I think it's kind of important sometimes for us to realize that there isn't always a kind of one size fits all way. We can be dynamic within a range and just sort of figure out, okay, how do I particularly target this organization? How do I kind of do the best job to hit the words, the phrases, and the right way to present this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's extremely useful. Thank you.
I guess it's around doing your research, isn't it, as to who you're replying to, and making sure you know as much information as you can around that organisation, and pitching accordingly, which can be so time consuming, I imagine, and a lot of effort, but worth it in the long run, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you've got to pick your battles, in terms of your overall strategy. I just spoke to a charity recently, and their big focus for the next year is major donors, corporates, and individual. So as a charity, you've got to pick your battles and say, okay, here are 3 big targets for the next year. Let's invest the resources into those. As you said, Emily, you're sort of saying, okay, if we're going after corporates, who? What kind of corporates are we actually going after? What does a good partner look like? Let's try a few different approaches. Let's test a few things. High net worth individuals. How do we find them? How do we reach out to them? So you can't do this across every single one of your communication channels and everything, but by starting somewhere, and I think eventually what it does mean is that you end up with a very large amount of landing pages on your website. And I mean, I use Notion as a tool. I don't know whether anyone's used it, but it's a sort of really advanced way of storing data, information, files. And so I'll have lots of templates set up. When I'm working with charities, I'll say, right, here's our proposal template for this kind of organization, this sort of size, this kind of industry. So at least once you've done it once, you're not having to go back to the drawing board every single time. You can say, okay, we know that this is this kind of corporate, we're going for this type of decision maker, they're either a sustainability head or they're in marketing or they're in PR. And so then we've got a sort of defined route that we can say, great, we can then use this proposal to write to them. So it is just building your kind of outreach brick by brick, but at the same time, it is just worth going back and thinking about it. And like I said, even the framework, the sort of hook to what structure is just thinking about that individual person and figuring out how do we best present this information to them. And like I said, I've seen it work in, corporates, individuals and grants. If you present the information as they want it, grab them early on and then give them a really succinct journey, generally the results will always increase. Depends slightly, but I've had a lot of 2 times, 5 times, 10 times success stories just by doing simple shifts of, presenting information differently, planning it a little bit more and making things look pretty. It's always amazing how much these things can make a difference.
Great stuff. There's a question in the comments there. I'm not sure whether you've seen that one, Louis. Are you saying you use the VARC system?
So I don't know. I mean, I think my system is from my own personal experience, and I will sort of say that is, I think that within behavioural consumer psychology, there's a plethora of sort of things to choose from. There's loads of information out there. I've just sort of developed a system that's kind of worked for me. It's not probably completely unique, but I've pulled lots of kind of component parts and pulled them together. But I always try and make things as simple as possible. So, I'm not one for using acronyms and complicated structures and things like that. It's always about just thinking about it in the most simplistic terms possible. And like I said, what I've always found that's worked for me, if I'm planning something out, start with the people, understand them, understand what drives them. The next bit is then just planning, is figuring out, okay, what do we need to do? How can we structure this better? The hook to what has been something that's worked for me for, almost 2 decades now. And then finally is just, making it look pretty. So, thanks for your comment. But no, I don't really use any predefined structures. I just try and take lots from different people and organizations that I've worked with and simplify it down to its easiest components.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anybody else? Okay, well, thank you so much, Louis, for such an insightful and thought-provoking session. I hope you've all found it useful today. And just to everybody who is there, to say thank you for joining us and for your participation. And I hope you're leaving with new ideas and inspiration to take back to your organisations. Just a quick reminder, a recording of today's session will be available. You can either email me directly or keep your eye on our LinkedIn pages where information about how you can access that will be available. Also, if you are on LinkedIn, do please comment on our posts to spread the word about the sessions that we run. And if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to discuss any of the techniques with Louis, please don't hesitate to reach out either direct to Louis or through myself. We're hosting our next event on the 30th of April, and that topic will be around financial stability in the voluntary sector. We've got a highly experienced finance director, Claire Reynolds, who's been operating within the not-for-profit sector for over 15 years, coming to talk to us around growth and contraction in the market, strategies around staying resilient, and the power of strong financial communication. So hopefully you'll be available to join us for some of that. And finally, on behalf of myself, Charity Recruit team, and Louis, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.